Good morning, ladies. We have been studying Elijah, the prophet, and today we will continue with that, and next week we'll actually meet Elisha, his successor. But before we start today, I want to just talk about what we've seen so far with Elijah. He has been an amazing man of God for Israel. It would be like someone who is a great national leader here in our country that is almost hero status. The idea of a leader who is able to do things that are, well, in our country we would say borderline miraculous. For Elijah, they were definitely miraculous. God performed many, many miracles by the hand of Elijah. And so wouldn't it be wonderful if we had a hero like that, a leader like that? We even talked about, in the Bible studies yesterday, we talked about movies that we may have enjoyed in the past who had just a phenomenal hero. We think of Superman, we think of Braveheart, or Rocky Balboa in the movie Rocky, or The Last of the Mohicans. There are so many that we could begin to list. Indiana Jones, that would be a good one. So there are a lot of heroes that people want to have a hero. It's something that we look for in leadership in our countries. So that's what we're going to talk about today. And I hope that you enjoy seeing how Elijah has been in the past a hero. But there is always that possibility that we can have a hero that can fail us. And so let's see what happens here with Elijah. We are in 1 Kings chapter 18, where we left off last week with the miraculous feat of our hero Elijah in the on Mount Carmel, when there was that incredible showdown between the idols of Baal that were being worshipped by King Ahab and Queen Jezebel and all of their prophets and so many of the people of Israel. And God won the day. Elijah was able to completely show up every single thing that the prophets of Baal were not able to do. Elijah was able to do with the power of God. So I'm going to pick up in verse 38 and read, just remind you a little bit about that showdown where Elijah calls down the fire of God, and then through the end of that chapter. Then the fire of the Lord fell and burned up the sacrifice, the wood, the stones, the soil, and even licked up the water in the trench. When all the people saw this, they fell prostrate and cried, "The Lord, He is God, the Lord, He is God." Then Elijah commanded them, "Seize the prophets of Baal. Don't let anyone get away." They seized them, and Elijah had them brought down to the Kishon Valley and slaughtered there. And Elijah said to Ahab, "You better go eat and drink, for it is the sound of heavy rain coming." So Ahab went off to eat and drink, but Elijah climbed to the top of Carmel, bent down to the ground, and put his face between his knees. "Go and look toward the sea," he told his servant. The servant went and looked. "There's nothing there," he said. 7 times Elijah said, "Go back." The 7th time the serpent reported, I'm saying that wrong, servant, sorry. The 7th time the servant reported, "A cloud as small as a man's hand is rising from the sea." So Elijah said, "Go tell Ahab, hitch up your chariot and go down before the rain stops you." Meanwhile, the sky grew black with clouds, the wind rose, a heavy rain started falling, and Ahab rode off to Jezreel. The power of the Lord came on Elijah, and tucking his cloak into his belt, he ran ahead of Ahab all the way to Jezreel. Now, can you even picture or imagine the magnitude of Elijah's victory? He is the nation of Israel's hero, just as big as any of the superstars that we already talked about. It all went according to plan, God's plan. God provided a magnificent drama in which Elijah was the star. It culminated in a great defeat of the 450 prophets of Baal being slaughtered by our hero. And then this amazing man prayed for the rain to come, and it did. Torrents and torrents of rain came. Then right on cue, Elijah tucks in his robe into his belt, transforming him at once into an Olympic sprinter. He didn't even need a phone booth to change into his superhero costume. Elijah ran so fast, he outpaced Ahab's chariot, and God gave him the juice to arrive in Jezreel in record time, adding to his impressive resume a new world record for the 14-mile sprint. Throw this man a party. Organize a parade down Main Street. Now, this is when we would cue the Rocky theme. Da-da-da, da-da-da. Okay, I don't sing. Anyway, that is kind of the setting for everything that we've already seen in the past 2 lessons with Elijah. We have seen him, going all the way back, we remember that he met with a widow and fed her and her son through God's miraculous provision of a cake of bread that she made from a little bit of oil and a little bit of meal that kept showing up every single day. It was miraculous. And Elijah was the facilitator for that. God used him. Then when the woman's son died, Elijah was there to facilitate again another miracle where God raised this small child from the dead. And then we have the showdown. So Elijah truly is famous now for all of the miraculous things that he has done. But as we all know, every hero can become a zero. Excuse me for that cheesy thing. We start in 1 Kings chapter 19 with the next stage of this drama. Now Ahab told Jezebel everything Elijah had done and how he had killed all the prophets with the sword. So Jezebel sent a messenger to Elijah to say, "May the gods deal with me, be it ever so severely, if by this time tomorrow I do not make your life like that of one of them." Elijah was afraid and ran for his life. So there would be no parade, no party for our hero Elijah. Instead, Elijah gets a death threat or a sentence from Queen Jezebel. Elijah surely must have expected some kind of apology or admission that her faith in the Baals had been misplaced and completely wrong. Surely she would turn to God after such a clear defeat of her idols. So much evidence was produced to prove her wrong. Elijah's case was open and shut, right? Instead, she digs in her royal heels and calls for the immediate execution of Elijah. Instead of seeing a miracle, Elijah becomes even more entrenched in her evil. The story wasn't supposed to turn out this way. In Elijah's mind, God is supreme and superior over all other powers, so why is this happening? Why do we feel the same kind of despair when we watch what's happening in our world today? Is the world really that broken? Why do people our age, I'm speaking of older people like us, Why do people our age often mention the good old days as though there was a time when everybody loved Jesus and all was right with the world because we memorized John 3:16? God so loved the world that he gave his only son, that whoever believes in him should not perish but have everlasting life. And we just stop right there. And we just think that that's the golden rule of how the world works. God loves us. He saves us. And that's that. But there's never been good old days. There's never been a time when everyone loved Jesus. And we see the effects of that. We know Romans tells us that the world is broken and the world is groaning under the weight of sin. And so to have a mentality that what has happened to this world, why is it so bad? Why is it worse than it ever was? Well, no, it has never been good. Since the Garden of Eden and Genesis chapter 3. I think that we forget that after John 3:16 comes the verse 18. Whoever does not believe in the Son is condemned because he has not believed in the name of the only Son of God. And this is the judgment. Light has come into the world, but people love darkness rather than light because their works were evil. For everyone who does wicked things hates the light and does not come to the light, lest his works should be exposed. So we all memorize verse 16, but we just kind of, I don't know if we ever even read 18, 19, and 20. So the reality is that we do live in a world of hard hearts, and that truth and reality can cause that. Truth and reality can cause us to be no different from Elijah and to despair. We can go from these incredible highs in our country and just cheer on our leaders and cheer on our president as though he was a hero, like, Daniel Day-Lewis in The Last of the Mohicans, or like Rocky, or like any other hero that we crave to have a hero, but they can't do it. Even the best of them cannot do it. The world is very broken, and it does cause us to despair. So we see Elijah in verse 3. Elijah was afraid and ran for his life. When he came to Beersheba in Judah, he left his servant there, while he himself went a day's journey into the wilderness. He came to a broom bush, sat down under it, and prayed that he might die. I have had enough, Lord, he said. Take my life. I am no better than my ancestors. Then he lay down under the bush and fell asleep. Elijah is so broken, so full of despair, and honestly, his brokenness and despair are legitimate. He's heartbroken over Israel's rejection of God and of him, but these circumstances have led him to illegitimate conclusions. He says, I have no more will to go on. I just want to die. Well, as followers of Jesus Christ, we aren't to be formed by our circumstances. Our hearts belong to Christ, and that fact should be forming our perspective. But often, we're just like Elijah with fearful hearts, and we will often surrender our hope and give in to despair. What are some of the very real circumstances, either locally and personally, or nationally or globally, that tend to cause you despair? Do you listen to the news of what is going on in your own community or in your own state or in your nation or globally? And do you listen to that news and despair and think there's no hope? That and it becomes so heavy and so weighty that we forget that God is still in the picture. He is still on his throne. Elijah's circumstances and concerns were legitimate, and they are understandable, but they're not an excuse. We are not to live under the circumstances, but in spite of the circumstances. 2 Corinthians 4, verses 8 and 9 says, "We are afflicted in every way, but we are not crushed. We are perplexed, but we are not driven to despair. We are persecuted, but we are not forsaken. We are struck down, but we are not destroyed." Isn't that very comprehensive? It covers everything. I don't know what kind of affliction that you have been dealing with, what kind of crushing kinds of things that are attacking your life, what kind of perplexing questions that you have. I feel very perplexed sometimes when I look at what's going on in the world, and especially as a Christian, as we weigh all of the input that bombards our inbox day after day after day, coming from all different perspectives and all different philosophies and opinions, and even Christian perspectives. And sometimes there are Christian perspectives that are in direct conflict with each other, and it perplexes my mind. And so the perplexity, though, should not drive me to despair. Persecution, we're promised that persecution will come, but God will not forsake us. We may even be killed, struck down, but we cannot be destroyed, because we have the eternal life of Jesus inside us. Then going on in 2 Corinthians 4 at verse 16, Paul says, "Therefore we do not lose heart. Though outwardly we are wasting away, yet inwardly we are being renewed day by day. For our light and momentary troubles are achieving for us an eternal glory that far outweighs them all." So we fix our eyes not on what is seen, but on what is unseen. Since what is seen is temporary, but what is unseen is eternal. Isn't that beautiful? Our heart. We've just finished a series on the heart from 1 and 2 Samuel. And here's Paul saying, don't lose heart. Your heart, your control center, is so critical that we keep our heart focused and not divided. Even though our world is groaning, even though our bodies are wasting away, yet inwardly we are being renewed day by day. And I love that Paul's perspective on his problems. I mean, I'm sure you've read everything that Paul went through in his ministry, with the number of times he was beaten or stoned, left for dead, shipwrecked, the kinds of issues and circumstances that Paul endured. He's calling them light and momentary. Seriously, Paul, you're calling those kinds of things light and momentary? I've never had any of those kinds of problems, and I would have a hard time calling them light and momentary. But he says those things are achieving for him and for us an eternal glory that far outweighs them all. In other words, we'll get to heaven and say, it's worth it all. But here's the key, verse 18. So we fix our eyes not on what is seen, but on what is unseen. Since what is seen is temporary, but what is unseen is eternal. Now, what does it mean to fix our eyes on something? How do we make Jesus come into focus? We do know that we are to fix our eyes on Jesus. That's Hebrews 12, or I think Hebrews 11 or 12. We are to fix our eyes on Jesus. We are to fix our focus on those things that are eternal, not our present circumstances. And so we've got to figure out, how do we fix our focus on Jesus? Well, let's look at an example. How about Peter walking on the water? Where was his focus? What happened when his focus initially was on Jesus? He kept his focus on Jesus and he walked on water. Now, that is not something that you see every day, but his eyes were fixed on Jesus. What happened when he fixed his eyes on the water and on the waves? He sank. Jesus had to rescue him. Thankfully, Jesus is faithful and he will rescue us. But we are supposed to keep our eyes on Jesus. So what is in your foreground right now? In the foreground of your picture? I know a lot of us take pictures with our phones, and they're just amazing cameras in our phones. But do you remember the cameras where you have to adjust the focus yourself? And if you know what you're doing, you can make the camera lens focus on something close up or something far away. And you can adjust it such that you can choose your focus. And it'll either be blurry in some places and crisp and well-defined in other places. So looking through the lens of your heart, what's in the foreground right now? Is it health issues? Is it family issues? Maybe economic or financial issues? Is your focus on the political issues of the day? The threats coming out of North Korea, out of China, out of Putin's mouth? What is the lens of your heart focused on? And can we admit that none of these problems are actually the cause of our despair? Instead, it's our heart focus that determines our perspective, or whether or not we are in despair. When I focus the eyes of my heart on what I see happening all around me, I will tend towards despair. And you know what despair does to me? It makes me pitifully insecure. And honey, I don't want to live like that. I don't want to have that kind of perspective on my life. So let's look again at Elijah. It seems that he feels like God hasn't really been fair with him. Verse 4 says, "I have had enough, Lord. Take my life. I'm no better than my ancestors." That's hopeless. It's as though Elijah thinks God had made a deal with him with something like, serve me, but tell me when it gets too tough. So Elijah's saying, when? Or maybe somewhere in the back of Elijah's mind, he had agreed to only go so far with God. I'll serve you, God, but only within the boundaries I have set for you. Like boundaries. I love Psalm 16, verse 6, where the psalmist says, "The boundary lines have fallen for me in pleasant places." And so we just naturally assume that means that everything is going to be pleasant all the time if we serve Jesus. And we forgot to read the parts about trouble and persecution and the kind of sifting and, the kind of refining that God promises that he will do for us. Refining hurts. It isn't fun, but it's part of the agreement that we have with God. So is it possible that we come up with our own plans for how God is going to behave in our lives? And we're not too pleased when he acts in ways that don't match our plan? I think of Mary and Martha, the sisters of Lazarus. We know that we could have healed our brother if you had only come when we first asked you. They had big plans for Jesus and how he was going to be the hero of their story. They never stopped to think that his plan could possibly have been even greater. Just like just like Mary and Martha, we limit God with our plans. Do you think it ever crossed Mary and Martha's mind that a resurrection was part of God's plan? I'm sure it didn't. That was just beyond their capacity to believe for that God was going to, well, okay, what if he dies? Maybe God will resurrect him. That probably didn't cross their minds. And we're the same way. We limit God by making our own plans. We think that our plan is going to be phenomenal, fantastic, yet not realizing that God's ideas are even better than ours and bigger and more incredible in how they will affect the world. God isn't the problem. Our despair and our unfocused hearts are our problem. Remember, God isn't our partner, our colleague, our assistant, our co-pilot, nor is he at our beck and call. He is God, for goodness sake. Can you identify any boxes you've put God in or limits you have given to him? I was listening to a Bible study on Elijah by Paige Brown, and she gives the illustration of, and it's just a complete hypothetical illustration, but she says, in New York City at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, there's that incredible Monet water lilies exhibit. It is phenomenal. And so she was proposing that you get a phone call from the curator of the museum, and the curator says, you are the lucky lady who has received permission to have the Monet exhibit for your own personal home. And it will be delivered to your home. And oh, by the way, these are the sizes and dimensions of these priceless works of art. Can you imagine that you would say, well, I don't know that that'll fit in my house. I have some frames we could put around it that I bought at Hobby Lobby, but, I don't know if they're big enough. I don't think we'd do that. I think we would blow the walls out of our house, build a new house, whatever. If we would just recognize the masterpiece that we have been offered, and we would do whatever it took to accept that incredible offer. And unfortunately, the reality is that when God lets us know that he has a plan for our lives, we often will say, I don't think so, because I don't want you messing with my children, or I don't want you messing with my health, or I don't want you messing with my grandchildren. And we kind of think that we can direct God around. Unfortunately, we have to learn a lesson and maybe in a hard way, like Elijah. Going back to Elijah in verse 5, he lay down under the bush and fell asleep. All at once an angel touched him and said, "Get up and eat." He looked around, and there by his head was some bread baked over hot coals and a jar of water. He ate and drank, and then lay down again. The angel of the Lord came back a second time and touched him and said, "Get up and eat, for the journey is too much for you." So he got up and ate and drank. Strengthened by that food, he traveled 40 days and 40 nights until he reached Horeb, the mountain of God. Just parenthetically, that is Mount Sinai. There he went into a cave and spent the night. I want you to just look at the kindness and tenderness in God's response to a very pouty, petulant Elijah. Notice God doesn't say, "Buck up, buttercup." He doesn't give him a pep talk or a reprimand, just provision. God created us body and soul. God also provides for us body and soul. It's so kind of him to first provide for Elijah's worn out and completely depleted body first. It reminds me of the old hymn, "Savior, like a shepherd lead us, much we need thy tender care." It's a beautiful hymn, and I hope you'll go look it up. Verse 9, "Then he came to a cave and lodged in it. And behold, the word of the Lord came to him and said to him, 'What are you doing here, Elijah?'" So we see God providing for Elijah spiritually here and enriching his soul. He leads him to a cave on Mount Sinai. Now, what is the significance of this place? Well, it's where God gave his people the covenant of relationship. What would that remind Elijah of? Well, it would remind him of God's faithfulness to him, even though Elijah is still pretty despairing. The Father so generously invites Elijah to vent, to just let it all out. He says, "I can take it." And he kindly offers us the same opportunity to unload our desperate pleas. God will even ask us questions, like he did Elijah, so we can get to the heart of the matter. He invites our honesty so he can give us new eyes to see him. Just a reminder about this specific cave that God brought him into. The theologians and historians believe it's the same cave that God brought Moses to. And we are about to see how God met Elijah there in that cave in the same way that he met Moses. But he asked him the question, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" Verse 10, Elijah says, "I have been very jealous for the Lord, the God of hosts, for the people of Israel have forsaken your covenant and thrown down your altars and killed your prophets with the sword, and I, even I only, am left, and they seek my life to take it away." Well, boy, did he vent. From what Elijah says to God, does it appear a couple of good meals have made much difference in his despair? Well, not yet, apparently. His eyes are still fearful and full of failure, thinking it was all on his shoulders to lift Israel out of its apostasy. Has he completely forgotten about the oil and the meal that miraculously showed up every day for months on end? Has he forgotten the little boy that was raised from the dead? Has he forgotten the miraculous showdown on Mount Carmel? Nope. The only message running on a loop in his brain is Jezebel's, "You'll be dead by tomorrow." So where's his perspective? His focus. His focus is still on himself and on his plans. He's still trying to figure out why God doesn't fit his picture frame. He still sees himself as the only one on God's side, and he's feeling more and more hopeless and more alone. So God, in his tender mercies, provides another miracle with the goal of Elijah seeing into God's heart for him. Verse 11, God said, "Go out and stand on the mount before the Lord." And behold, the Lord passed by, and a great and strong wind tore the mountains and broke in pieces the rocks before the Lord. But the Lord was not in the wind. And after the wind there was an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake, a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire, the sound of a whisper, a low whisper. And when Elijah heard it, he wrapped his face in his cloak and went out and stood at the entrance of the cave. And behold, there came a voice to him and said, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" Surely this display of God's power will reach into Elijah's soul and bring him into a right perspective. Like the demonstration on Mount Carmel, God knows how to show off his incredible power with lots of visible fireworks and sound. But unlike Mount Carmel, God appears to be displaying his quiet ways also. He isn't to be found in the spectacular, but in the quietness and the stillness. So I can imagine God's voice being barely above a whisper. Spurgeon says this about Elijah. He first wrapped his mantle about his face. He became subdued and awe-stricken, full of reverence. Oh, it was a great thing. It is a great thing when a sinner is willing to wrap his face when he is confounded and say, I cannot defend my course, I am guilty. We know that if at our judgment seat a man pleads guilty, he is punished. But at the judgment seat of the gospel of our Lord Jesus Christ, whoever pleads guilty is forgiven. So wrap your face. Isn't that a beautiful statement from Spurgeon? Well, let's see if Elijah hears whispers better than fireworks. God had asked him the second time, what are you doing here, Elijah? And verse 14 gives his response. I have been very jealous for the Lord, the God of hosts, for the people of Israel have forsaken your covenant, thrown down your altars, and killed your prophets with the sword. And I, even I only, am left, and they seek my life to take it away. You know, it appears Elijah is still quite preoccupied with himself. He has done far too much navel gazing. His despair continued to consume him with his feelings of unfairness and loneliness and hopelessness. But God doesn't scold him or punish him. He wisely gives him a job. I recently heard a counselor say that one of the chief causes of depression is the preoccupation with self. Nobody cares. I'm all alone. I might as well die. And then this counselor went on to say that one of the best things we can do for our mental health is to get busy helping others. Verse 15, and the Lord said to him, go return on your way to the wilderness of Damascus. And when you arrive, you shall anoint Hazael to be king over Syria, and Jehu, the son of Nimshi, you shall anoint to be king over Israel. Oh, I'm sorry, the first one was Syria. The next one is Israel. And anoint Elisha, the son of Shaphat of Abel Menholah, you shall anoint to be prophet in your place. And the one who escapes from the sword of Hazael shall Jehu put to death, and the one who escapes from the sword of Jehu shall Elisha put to death. Yet I will leave 7,000 in Israel, all the knees that have not bowed to Baal, and every mouth that has not kissed him. God reminds Elijah that he still has work to do. I would imagine that gives him hope and purpose so that he quits feeling sorry for himself. I'm pretty sure he is no longer afraid of Jezebel either. But Elijah needed a friend. The core of his complaint before God was that he was alone. God let him know that there was a man ready to learn from this great prophet and to be his disciple and his friend. Elijah also needed hope, and since Elisha would be raised up as a successor to Elijah's prophetic office, Elijah then knew that his work would continue even after his death. And finally, God tells him that he will always maintain for himself a remnant of faithful followers. In closing, I want to point out some amazing similarities between Elijah and Moses. In Exodus 33, God calls Moses to come up and meet him on Mount Sinai, and God took him to the cave where he gave Moses an experience very similar to the one with Elijah. God protected Moses there in the cleft of the rocky cave. Theologians believe that God has led Elijah to the exact same cave because of the definite article used in the Hebrew here in 1 Kings 19. God appears to be particularly fond of both these men by giving them such unique opportunities, both of them so similar. And then Nearly 1,000 years later, God honors both these same two men by having them meet with his only son Jesus on a very high mountain where they are allowed to see him transfigured in all his glory. God's plans are so much bigger than ours. If we can keep our perspective fixed and focused on God and whatever his plan is, we will not sit in despair and depression and loneliness and insecurity over what is going on in the world today, whether it be personally in your family or in a huge global situation. God is on his throne. Amen.